Now, over the past week, the eyes of the Gaelic world have been on the Maud and Portree. At the same time in Aberdeen, the Doric Festival has been celebrating the dialect of the North East. And the Scottish National Dictionary Association is about to launch its latest CD-ROM, a spell check in Scots. Yet Scotland's languages and dialects have had a struggle to survive. Even regional accents were frowned on by the broadcast media in particular until the 1980s. So in a moment, we'll have a look at how important that linguistic battle has become in shaping our own national culture. But first, David Calder has been finding out about the state of Scots.
The trouble with most Scots dialects is they've been treated for far too long as a joke.
Well, hello there. Hello, good morning. Good morning and welcome back to Radio Caithness. This is your swinging, fun-loving desk jockey, Johnny Poulson, bringing ye all at the very best in radio entertainment across the hills and moors of Caithness. Now, following the government green paper on broadcasting, we've had to come up with brand new frequencies, and we're now on 809.6 megacycles, 504.9 attocycles, and 1 bicycle.
It's a gentle, affectionate humour, but we laugh all the same at the way some of our kinsfolk speak. For too long, Scots has been regarded as a second-class language, one which you're taught not to use at school. And this, says Dr. Chris Robinson of Edinburgh University, has now been recognised as a mistake.
When a child comes into school with Scots as its first language, and the teacher says, "You are speaking bad English," that child feels its language is being rejected. You reject the language, you reject the child. We have generations of Scots growing up with this knock to their confidence.
It's a very heavily stigmatised way of speaking.
Alasdair Allan, Vice President of the Scots Language Society.
It's a way of speaking that you want to hear in genteel, douce, decent, polite company. So Scots doesn't have a standard in the way that Gaelic or English does. What Scots has is a spread over a continuum from standard English to traditional Scots at the other end. So most folk operates squeeze about some way in the middle between the two.
The stigma attached to using Scots dialect is mainly an issue in central Scotland. There are still people in Edinburgh, for instance, who shudder a little when they hear someone, as they would put it, speaking badly. But that's not true of the whole country.
At the time het folk neemt the north end o' Eden, a moose fu sons gied frame to the land. Every beicht, every now, a word picked er in Norn. They had buddies of words for the varge, the crofter, sons of the crew, the crub, and the hull, some lost on the wind o' the flacky o' years.
Christine De Luca recently won the Shetland Literary Prize for her book of poems, Walk with the Valkyries. She argues that the reason the dialect survived was that everyone in the islands used it.
I think we've been very lucky in Shetland that we haven't really had that. The dialect is a fairly classless way of speech. I think, again, partly because of its distinctiveness, we're taught when to switch it on and when to switch it off. And incomers very often let their children learn the dialect, as long as they're learning standard English as well. OK, we say it with a Shetland accent, but we try to make ourselves understood. There isn't that same stigma attached to speaking the dialect.
She also insists that a vital aspect about maintaining the vitality of a language is that people continue to use it, not just as a vehicle for day-to-day communication, but also for literature.
It's got to stand up alongside English literature and Scots literature, and the writers of it have got to submit their work to the critical community and have it printed in mainstream literature. I think that gives a strong message to young people in Shetland that their dialect is worthy. It can carry feeling and can carry ideas as well as any other dialect or indeed mainstream language.
The fact that Gaelic has survived at all, given the efforts of the British state to ban it, is evidence of just how hard it is to suppress a culture. Now it's given official backing, and young people, like the Oban High School Choir at this week's Maud in Portree, can take a pride in their heritage. But But the future of Gaelic will depend not on sentiment but on practicality. For the first time, it'll be used as the language of teaching for 2 degree courses at the new University of the Highlands and Islands. Dr Morag McNeill, who's helping to set up the School for Language, Culture and Heritage, says it's a vital development.
The new degrees through the medium of Gaelic in Gaelic-related studies and North Atlantic studies are providing such opportunity to enhance and extend the language in terminology, in conceptual thinking, again in debate. We're looking at the moment to establish our PhD programme. At this point, the level of interest expressed in this in terms of language, culture and heritage has been very strong and very encouraging.
When the Scottish Parliament comes into being next year, it will take responsibility for education, language and culture. A lot of people are expecting so much of this new institution.
We'll be able to, I suppose, lobby for Gaelic closer to home, and that way I don't think it'll get any worse.
It's up to the, for the ones from the lowlands like myself, I'm from, to be a wee bit more educated along that way.
Anything Scottish is bound to help the Gaelic language.
And Morag McNeill hopes it will turn out to be a multilingual organisation.
The plans in place for the new Parliament do already offer that potential. I believe it's the case that the equipment for simultaneous translation is being considered as part of the integral architecture of the new building.
Gaelic may be spoken at Holyrood, but will Scots? Alasdair Allan of the Scots Language Society hopes that it will, but accepts that it may face something of an uphill struggle.
What it'll take is a handful brave bodies to throw the jeering and laughter they'll get for doing it for the first wee while. We've come to a state now where Scots is so associated in the public mind with humour and with couthiness or with clartiness that it will be difficult for a wee while for folk to use Scots and still be thought to as decent, respectable members of the Scottish Parliament or decent, respectable members of society. But that's a hurdle yet to get over.
That report from David Calder. And joining us to look at some of the issues facing our languages are Sandy Stronach, Chair of the Doric Festival, who's in Aberdeen, John Law, former President of the Scots Language Society, who's in Dundee, whilst in Inverness is Alan Campbell, Chief Executive of Common na Gaelic. Alan, you've just had a week in Portree which seems to have been successful, but on the other hand, there doesn't seem to be a huge impact over the last few years in the number of people who are fluent Gaelic speakers.
Good morning, Ruth, or maybe I should say Martin Van. No, I think that's a fair comment, but then it takes a bit of time to stop the supertanker before you can start turning it around, and that's not any kind of excuse. I suppose it's really part of the realism of the situation that faces us in Gaelic. As we heard in that package just now, there is almost a century of educational wisdom which has told us as Gaelic speakers that this language had no value, and that if we wanted to make progress in the world, then English was the way forward. And I suppose that the hardest task we have to face now within our Gaelic community is to try and convince the Gaelic language speakers that this language does have value, that it does have a future, and that it does have a relevance. It is not so difficult to do that with young people who don't have the hang-ups, but with the older people, they need a lot of convincing because their own life's experience has been a very negative one.
Do you find that in that generation of which you were just speaking there, that they still have a prejudice that their sons and daughters might be disadvantaged by having Gaelic as their first language, by being bilingual in that way?
I think they would dearly love to believe that would not be the case. But you see, the part of the problem still is, although we've made a lot of progress in terms of Gaelic over the last 15 to 20 years, and we now have 56 primary school units throughout Scotland teaching through the medium of Gaelic. But the reality is that these units are still there on a grace and favour basis. They're there because of local government support and because, if you like, to some extent, local authorities and politicians are prepared to take a bit of political risk to respond to what the parents aspire to. But there is no guarantee that these things, that these Gaelic medium units have any security of tenure, because against the background of local government spending restrictions, there is almost a danger that these could be taken away. So parents look at Gaelic medium education as something that is a luxury.
Not yet a fixture.
But it's not a right.
Let me bring in Sandy Stronach here, as I say, chair of the Doric Festival. I guess in a sense, though you may blow me out the water for suggesting this, Sandy, in a sense that we're talking here about two languages and a dialect, Doric being more of a dialect than an independent language.
Disagree entirely.
Here's a surprise.
Historically, English and German, for example, are sister languages, and there are differences have occurred over generations to make them far more distinct. And the same was happening with English and Scots from Anglo-Saxon. But we've got quite a pressure now from media and education system. Someone calculated that 500 million is spent on promoting English. So on a 10% basis, that would give us 50 million, 25 to the Doric Scots and 25 million to Gaelic.
Well, what about Scots?
Scots.
Well, you see, I'll come to John Law in a minute who may pour some oil in this debate, but many people would believe that Doric, like indeed some of, dare I say it, the dialects elsewhere in Scotland, are part of the generic language known as Scots.
Oh yes, I accept that. What I would maybe claim is that the Doric in the northeast is probably the strongest dialect. Next to maybe Shetland one. It was a very nice reading we had from Shetland. And there's still oral traditions. Still a lot of people speak Doric Scots. But if asked in a census, they would probably claim they spoke English.
The interesting thing, John, if we look at that is, there was Sandy arguing for, a divvying up of as yet unidentified funds to strengthen the language. Gaelic, as we know, got some funds from the previous government and has been reasonably successful with the current government. Scots probably feels a little undernourished by comparison, and I guess you wouldn't want to hand over all of a new kitty completely to Doric.
Well, of course, there is a tremendous resource and problem for Scots, and there is a change in public policy this year which should be awfully significant, in that the government has signed up to the European Charter on Regional and Minority Languages, and that imposes three major constraints on government in the way it must formulate its policy. It is an international legal obligation that they have accepted. First of all, they must take resolute action to promote regional and minority languages and facilitate and encourage the use. Secondly, they must bring in proper provision in education at all stages. And thirdly, they must make sicker that these languages, Gaelic and Scots, are properly recognised in official business. Now, that constitutes a policy, but the resourcing hasn't caught up with it as far as Scots is concerned. For example, the staff at the Scots Language Resource Centre are doing the road at the moment. They've had to be paid off because the government hasn't provided the siller to meet the business plan.
Nevertheless, that's a sort of pessimistic thought that, as you say, that's had to that organisation has had hopefully temporarily to shut its doors. But there has been, has there not, John, quite a major shift in attitudes. I'm thinking, for instance, of the educational resource brought in a couple of years ago called the KIST, which has got resource material for teachers in both Gaelic and Scots. Now, that's a huge shift in one generation from children going into school and getting belted for not talking properly.
Well, I think there's certainly a process of thought going on, and there's certainly resources within the education system that could be brought for it to improve the position of Scots. But in the end of the day, the Scots language will die, whether in the North East Shetland or anywhere else, unless we have new speakers. And that means Scots right through the education system, not just respecting the language that Bairns brings to school, to use it as a kind of medium for getting them instructed in English, but continuing with the language so that instead of the education system calling them out as Scots, they finish up still able to speak Scots, and that has to be right through to advanced levels in the education system.
I wonder, Sandy, if you think there's been any consumer resistance in the classroom. I don't mean from the kids, but from the teachers themselves, who may, some of them, not have any particular facility with Scottish languages.
Say they're racist because they speak French. So we do have a problem in schools, but I must admit I go around a lot of schools, and there is a great encouragement now for children to write in it as well, and that maybe brings John in with a spelling check type idea. But I do think that there's also, beside this, can I just say, Ruth, there's a growing interest in the public in their traditions and place names and their own family histories. So if we set that along with the encouragement of language, I see quite a hope for the future.
I wonder though, Alan, just talking Sandy, talking about place names there, we know that in Wales the Welsh language has been, a real motivator in terms of the political process. In a sense, although we seem to be more enthusiastic about our languages now, we've never been as political about them.
No, I think that's true, and certainly as far as Gaelic is concerned, I think there have been those who have argued that we should have used, let's use the euphemism, civil disobedience more actively in the past. But it was the view of those involved, if you like, at the active end, or the majority of those involved at the active end of Gaelic development over the last 20 to 25 years, that we should keep that in reserve. We've never said we wouldn't resort to it, but what we've said was that while other processes worked for us, we didn't see any great benefit in going down the road of serious civil disobedience.
Presumably you've also got to take public opinion with you. I mean, I'm thinking, if you remember at the start of the Northern Ireland Assembly, some of the nationalists got dismissed as being a bit cranky for using or insisting on using Irish, despite the fact that perhaps 3/4 of their audience could neither speak nor understand it. Now, if you were to try something similar at the new Scottish Parliament, would you get the same reaction?
I think that's quite possible, but I think it's terribly important. John referred a minute ago to the whole issue of the survival of the Scots language. And I mean, every language and culture's survival actually does not depend on government or money. It depends on the people who speak it. But for these people to have confidence and faith in that language, they have to be motivated. They have to see that there is recognition and that their language has respect. We were told back in 1985 by George Younger, who was then Secretary of State for Scotland, he said to the first Gaelic conference that Gaelic would not survive because the government legislated. It would survive because the people willed it. But he then went on to say that if the people demonstrated that will, the government must respond. So I suppose what we're saying is that with a Scottish Parliament, we are looking for some tangible response which will recognise what we have achieved. But we do not for a second believe that the Scottish Parliament will be any kind of panacea for our language, but it must recognise it.
I wonder, John, I mean, when Alan talks about it not just being a matter of resources, although but a matter of recognition too, it strikes me that also very important is the attitude not just of teachers, as we've heard from Sandy, but of children. Now, is Scots a living language in the sense that children in playgrounds are still, if you like, coming up with new Scots terms?
Well, I think that's very much the case, and I mean, there was a government study in 1996 on just what the prevalence of Scots in the country might be, and obviously English and Scots exists along a kind of continuum of language, but the government opinion of the General Registrar Office, there's maybe as many as 1.5 million of us that could be looked on as being more at the Scots end than at the English end of the language spectrum.
How do you define that, John? How do we decide? I mean, all of us who were born and raised in Scotland use a smattering of Scots, at least in normal conversation, but how do you define the dividing line between that and, if you like, a Scots speaker?
Well, I don't think you can make a hard and fast line, can you? I mean, it guns all the way from a smattering to a weena Scots in what you say. And that's how you had to look at it.
Well, how important are new resources like? I mean, I was intrigued by your new CD-ROM that's just coming out, the Canny Spell checker. I mean, how important is that at getting at that age group?
Well, I think it's important to have standards. If you're going to introduce a language properly into the education system, then you had to teach the bairns something. And if you've nae richt way of spelling the lead, then, how can you ever settle down to put it in paper? And that's very important for official business. What about, if Sandy there gets elected to the Scottish Parliament and stands up on his hind legs to speaking Scots, what are we going to do? Translate them into English in order to record it in the Scottish Hansard? The original remarks will have to be left in the lead they're made in, surely, in the case of both Scots and Gaelic.
Would we need a glossary for you, Sandy?
No, you wouldn't. I don't think there should be glossary in books anyway. That they force the people to actually read the words.
But I mean, you must, and if you're going to speak in broad Doric, then presumably there's people outside the northeast of England, especially sitting in a parliament in Edinburgh, might have some difficulty in getting the gist of what you're saying.
Yes, but I mean, for example, all this last week with our bad weather, the weather forecasters in the BBC have used the word dreich, which is a perfect example of how to use it.
And alarmingly accurate as well.
Yes.
But is that, does it matter? I mean, I was talking about the canny spell check. Does it matter to you if kids speaking Doric know how to spell the words they're using?
Well, you see, we've got a problem with this. I mean, I, for example, would spell guid, G-U-I-D, and allow other people in other areas like Brechin to say good. But if you take English, which went from oral to written, just take the O-U-G-H spelling, and it's got about 9 pronunciations. So why should Scots be the one language which has a definite spelling for a different pronunciation?
John?
Oh, well, I think this is a matter of, gradually winning towards standards that everybody recognises, and it's not as if there's no tradition of spelling Scots. There is a tradition of spelling Scots that everybody can well recognise, and the wee variants in it, I think, didn't matter.
I wonder, finally, gentlemen, Alan first, we've had the languages sort of progressing with peaks and troughs, as most movements do over the last years. I mean, we had the great euphoria about Gaelic programming and then some of it being screened at 4 a.m. I mean, what degree of optimism are you viewing the future with, Alan?
Well, I think people involved in language development, as I am, have to be optimistic, Ruth. I mean, if I weren't optimistic, then, I wouldn't be effective at all. I mean, it may well be that some people think I'm not effective as it is, but I'd certainly be less effective if I wasn't optimistic. I have to be optimistic, and certainly as far as the Scottish Parliament is concerned, I said earlier it would not and should not be seen as any kind of panacea for us or Scots either, I would suggest. But it is inconceivable that a Scottish Parliament will come to Scotland after 300 years that does not give a place to that which is truly Scottish.
John?
There'd be no point in having a Scottish Parliament if they wouldn't let you speak in it.
And you're planning to stand to do so?
No, myself.
Sandy?
Yes, I'm quite confident, and this week alone we had over 100 children that had a house, their own plays, reciting poems, etc. A lot of young people in our area seem to be picking it up, and they're being encouraged. And some, if I can make one point, some incomers are desperate for their children to do this little Doric that we have up here.
Doric in an English accent? I can hardly wait to hear it. Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Many thanks to all our guests and contributors. Stay tuned to Radio Scotland for the rest of your Sunday listening. But from producer Alasdair MacLeod and me, Ruth Wishart, it's goodbye for now.